Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Friday, the 22nd of March here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker. Coming up today, Apple's value drops by more than $110 billion as the tech giant's legal challenges mount. The Bank of England inches closer to rate cuts as the hawks retreat. Plus, Reddit pops. Shares in the social media firm rise by 48% as investors embrace their AI pitch. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. Apple's value has dropped by $113 billion as regulators in the US and EU accuse the tech giant of abusing its market dominance. Once the world's most valuable firm with a market cap of more than $3 trillion, Apple has underperformed both the Nasdaq 100 and the S&P 500 this year. Now, the latest slide in the tech firm's share price has seen the back of the US Attorney General Merrick Garland suing the company, accusing it of blocking rivals from accessing hardware and software features on the iPhone.
We allege that Apple has employed a strategy that relies on exclusionary, anti-competitive conduct that hurts both consumers and developers. For consumers, that has meant fewer choices, higher prices and fees, lower quality smartphones, apps, and accessories, and less innovation from Apple and its competitors.
Merrick Garland's US Justice Department lawsuit has been strongly refuted by Apple, who have called it wrong on the facts and the law. The iPhone maker also faces a competition probe by the EU, which could levy penalties of up to 10% of global annual revenue. And earlier this month, Apple was hit with a €1.8 billion penalty from the bloc over allegations that it shut out music streaming rivals on its platforms. Now, the Bank of England took a big step towards cutting interest rates at its March meeting. Although the central bank kept rates on hold, none of its policymakers are now voting for rate rises. And the central bank governor, Andrew Bailey, says the Bank of England can cut rates before reaching its 2% inflation target.
Yeah, we don't have to actually get inflation all the way back to target sustainably to cut rates, for instance, because what we have to do is be convinced that it is going to go there. You know, we should act ahead of time in that sense because we have to be forward-looking.
Reacting to those words from the governor, Andrew Bailey, markets moved up their first expected rate cut to June. Bailey's comments bring the Bank of England more in line with the Fed and the ECB. Meanwhile, UK consumers are the most confident they've been about their personal finances in years. GfK's measure, tracking the way that people feel about their finances, rose to +2 in the latest survey. That's the first positive reading since December of 2021. The figures indicate personal budgets remain strong, even as the Bank of England chose to hold interest rates at a 16-year high. Now, after 6.5 years in exile, the man who tried to break up Spain is making a comeback. Carles Puigdemont, who led the Catalan independence movement and caused Spain's worst political crisis since it became a democracy, is now planning to run for his old job as president of Catalan in May elections.
I'm not looking for what is most comfortable and less risky on a personal level. I could not explain to myself, after having spent 6.5 years defending the presidency in exile, now that we have an opportunity to restore the presidency that was unjustly, illicitly and illegally destitute by Article 155.
That was Puigdemont speaking there via a translator and referring to Article 155. That's the law that the Spanish government used in 2017 to force the regional Catalan administration to obey national law after a referendum. Now, there are some signs of progress towards a possible Gaza peace agreement at the same time as Israel is threatening to invade Rafah. This as US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East attempting to help broker a deal between Hamas and Israel. Bloomberg's Ed Baxter has the story.
Delegations from Israel, the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt will meet today to try to draw up a plan so that the invasion does not have to happen. But Israel's Minister for Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, on a U.S. podcast says Hamas infrastructure remains in Rafah.
What you saw on October 7th was a genocidal force that wants to wipe out all the Jews. And it's the first pogrom that we've had since the birth of the State of Israel. We have the ability to defend ourselves.
He says if there is not a peace deal, the assault will happen. Ed Baxter, Bloomberg Radio.
And finally, Reddit's first day jump delivered returns to shareholders benefiting from the rebound in the company's valuation. Shares climbed 48% on Wednesday in the fourth largest US take public of the year. COO Jen Wong says the Reddit IPO process has been full of benefits.
Becoming a public company has just made us a better company. We've actually been in this process longer than most, almost 2 years actually. And that process has made us more disciplined, more operationally rigorous, and actually allowed us to get to know investors better and tell our story.
Reddit's Jen Wong there speaking to Bloomberg. Almost a third of the 22 million shares sold in the Reddit IPO were owned by the company's own executives and employees who got a $228 million payday. Now, in just a moment, we're going to get more then on the EU leaders who are gathering in Europe. They are talking about security. They're talking about the war in Ukraine and also how to bolster the eastern flank of Europe, possibly even enlarging the EU 27. Distant possibility, but possible. We'll assess with Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in just a moment. This, though, also caught my eye this morning. And we're going to talk a lot about Apple, of course, today. The share price under enormous pressure. It's been hit by yet another lawsuit by competition authorities. Bloomberg opinion columnist Dave Lee has a really interesting piece out this morning for why the United States should not back Apple into a corner. He's talking about the iPhone's quality being at the heart of the lawsuit against it from the DOJ in the US, and that any potential remedies are a touchy subject, according to Dave Lee, because he says that the thinking in the complaint is that Apple reinforces the moat around its smartphone monopoly, not making products more attractive to its users, but by discouraging innovation that threatens Apple's smartphone. So he's sort of talking about, what the thinking is behind the lawsuit. And he says that he basically disagrees with that framing and that actually the iPhone makes an amazing product for its consumers and that the US lawsuit shouldn't do damage to that business. It's a really nice piece that's on the Bloomberg terminal this morning. In the meantime, though, let's actually do a bit of a deep dive into why Apple's share price slid so much yesterday, 4.1%. It wiped out $113 billion from the market valuation of Apple. It comes as investors have been quite spooked by another major US lawsuit accusing the iPhone maker of blocking rivals from accessing its hardware and its software features. And then Apple also under regulatory scrutiny in Europe. Joining me now is Bloomberg's tech editor, Vlad Savov. Vlad, good morning. Great to have you with me. So how significant do you think this DOJ Attorneys General lawsuit in the US actually is? You heard a bit of Merrick Garland just earlier at the start of the program.
Yeah, I mean, it does signal taking things very seriously. This antitrust consideration, both with respect to Apple and Google, is an interesting one to me because they don't really fit any sort of traditional definition of a monopoly. After all, Apple can always come and say, listen, Google's Android is the world's most dominant mobile operating system. We have a smaller market share, much in the way that Apple does with its MacBook compared to Windows PCs. It has a smaller market share. But the influence and the power that Apple wields over its own ecosystem is such that companies can literally go out of business if Apple makes a particular business decision. Take a good example, Meta. When Apple decided that it would make privacy a bigger selling point for its devices, it cut into user tracking, and that significantly hurt Meta with its ad targeting. So these are multi-billion-dollar decisions that Apple can make that affect other businesses. And again, the DOJ, Merrick Garland, everyone is signaling that they're taking it seriously, much like the EU is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Bloomberg's been reporting about Apple being about to face this EU probe because of the new Digital Markets Act. Again, how serious and significant will that be?
Well, like I say, I think the EU has taken an earlier initiative on this. They've been doing this for a while. And then Apple and Google have kind of tried to dodge the raindrops of regulation, if I can put it that way. They had the 30% fee on sales in the App Store. They were forced to remove those, but then they added other surcharges and fees for developers. So the situation is still unsatisfying for the developers. And if I may, I would actually disagree with Dave Lee in his opinion piece. I think the DOJ makes a good and strong case. When they talk about competition, Apple's its conditions for developers can get really nitpicky. And effectively, Apple doesn't want them to present things as beautifully and attractively as content on the App Store. It doesn't want things that can be monetized in outside ways to be as attractive to the user. So that definitely puts up a barrier. It puts up a hurdle for others. And Apple's case, I mean, again, in agreement with Dave, is that that's how Apple ensures the quality of the user experience. That's the argument that the company puts up.
Yes.
But as I say, regulators, Europe or the US, are taking more of a dim view of that nowadays.
Yeah, indeed. I think that's a good point. Well made. Look, and just lastly, why now do you think that the pressure is piling on? Why now are investors getting worried? As you say, I mean, there's been sort of concerns around these issues for some time, but it's just a string of anti-competitive investigations.
That's right. Looking at the investors in particular, I would say nowadays in the tech industry, AI is effectively a calling card. And Apple is one of these companies that doesn't really have AI leadership in the same way that, say, Microsoft and Google can say. It's still very heavily dependent on hardware sales. So if you're an investor, you're already looking at a very highly valued company and you're looking at its forward prospects. And look, the EV project, got shut down.
Yes.
The Vision Pro is a very expensive product. The iPhone is actually struggling in China. It's down 24% to start the year. And then Apple doesn't have a great answer on the AI front. So things like regulatory issues, which are going to hit exactly its monetization of the devices out in the market, are going to be a higher priority now.
Okay. Vlad, thank you so much for being with me. Vlad Savov is Bloomberg's tech editor. So just explaining the drop in Apple's share price and all of the investigations. Thank you so much. Let's turn our attention, though, to Europe now. European Union leaders have agreed to open membership talks with Bosnia-Herzegovina as it tries to counter Russian influence in the Balkans. This as EU leaders are nearing an agreement to use the proceeds of blocked assets to help fund Ukraine's military needs. So Russian blocked assets. Joining me now to discuss Bloomberg's Oliver Crook. Good morning, Ollie. What to do with the frozen Russian assets? Momentum seems to be building for profits generated from these assets to be used and put towards Ukraine.
Yeah, in some sense, this is actually the most important question before EU leaders this week, and it's the one where they've not yet found a way to reach consensus on. We heard from von der Leyen last night saying that if they did, that could mean that the first €1 billion could hit bank accounts in Ukraine by the 1st of July, which is a fairly accelerated timeline. But around the conflict here and the debate is whether or not that money can be used towards military purposes versus reconstruction. Really, a majority, I would say, of states want it to be able to be used for military purposes, but there are some holdouts, and really it's a question about getting that sustainable financing for Ukraine for, potentially many years to come. And you have these 260 billion euros of Russian assets, and really they want to mobilize it. What I think is very interesting, and I think this is something that will get some traction in the coming months and weeks, is this U.S. proposal, which, in sort of true U.S. fashion, they're calling them freedom bonds, which is basically looking to use the future profits of frozen assets, issue bonds backed by the future profits of these assets. And that could generate up to $50 billion worth of it. So it's really trying to front load getting more money out of those assets, because right now they're only throwing off about $3 billion a year worth of interest, and touching the underlying assets, though the U.S. would like to see that, is a much more complicated political matter.
Okay, that's an interesting explanation. How near do you think is further expansion, though, of the EU, talking about, the concerns that Europe has in terms of Russian influence, on the Baltic region?
Well, it certainly accelerated the process. I mean, when you think about the last time that this happened with Croatia, it took about 10 years to get them into the EU. And there's a huge amount of paperwork. There's a lot of consensus that is required. Of course, unanimity is another thing that's required from the EU. But basically, this has lit the fire under the EU, and they think about this much more geostrategically. And they've agreed to open membership talks now with Bosnia. We heard a lot about it from the EU leaders as they were walking in yesterday, that the lauding Bosnia for really making a lot of progress for aligning its values and standards, foreign policy with the EU, and evidently enough to a point that they've now agreed to open up the membership talks. So the other thing that we're also looking at here is, instead of having a full membership, there has.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond. Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app, and Bloomberg.com. Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa device. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.